Yeah, terrific.
Inaugural Stella Day out here in Melbourne. I'd like to introduce you to Auntie Carolyn, who's going to surprise everyone today. Thank you.
Thank you, and it was a lovely surprise because, you're in Melbourne all these years and you suddenly find that there's a theatre somewhere underground. So I thought, gosh, and then I heard that there used to be out there film, art house. I missed out on all that too. I was laughing because I'd worked at Treasury at one stage. They put us there. And then you don't realise what's around you. So it is an honour to be here this morning and pay my respects to all of you because this is the beginning of a new chapter for Stella. And it's Stella Day Out. Do we like that label? I think it's beautiful. I'm learning all about it. And it's going to travel around, and it's a place for young people or older people or midway people to have an opportunity, whatever their life opportunities, to be able to express using Stella Day Out. That's what my understanding is. So I just met a few wonderful, inspiring writers. So, and catching up with a dear friend I haven't seen for a couple of months. So, in the language afforded to me, it's Womanjika, Marambik Big Bunarong, Namda Baruptan Atta Willem. Welcome to our beautiful home, the lands of the two great bays, Naram, Port Phillip Bay, and Merrin, Western Port Bay. So our country goes from the Werribee River right down to the east and then to the south, right to what you know as Wilson's Promontory or Warmoon. I can say this because I've got a big native title claim in. That's a big thing. 26 years I've been fighting. I said it's like a life sentence. And if you think about that when you're fighting a system, and it's been a big challenge, but hopefully when the judge does his final presentation, we have our rights and recognise who we are within a system what's negated us for many hundreds of years. So it's been a journey. And as a descendant of Melbourne's first people, of the Yalukit Weelam of the Bunwurrung language group, of the people of the greater Kulin nation, I'm pleased to be able to welcome you all. I believe it is important that all Australians understand and appreciate the history of our first peoples of Melbourne. This is the traditional country of the Bunwurrung. We were one of the 5 major language groups that made up the larger Eastern Kulin at the time of the first European settlement. The area was occupied by the Yaluk Weelam clan. Yaluk means the people of the river. So as river flowed all the way down to what you know as Monmouth or Point Nepean. The language in different bands is different to, it's the language is Bunwurrung, but there was Yalukit Weelam, Nark Weelam, Mayon Balak. So there was different clan groups all along that area. We are the last surviving people of that area. It is over 180 years since the Europeans first entered our country and came up our sacred river we now call the Birrarung, but was known by the early settlers as the Yarra. What we have learnt from our ancestors' achievements still resonates with us. This included the core values. Yelenge, knowledge, deep knowledge. Showing respect, Dilbrook. Celebrating life, Chinabi. Honouring sacred ground, Pavanata. The importance of learning, or the importance of that Yelenge We have always valued that commitment to learning. It has been a part of every generation since time began, and it's one of the reasons why we are still strong today. Nothing is documented. I'm writing it now. I wrote my PhD when I was 70 and somehow been made a professor. So that's my other role. Oh, I'm standing in for someone today. Showing respect, or Dilruk. We respect the Wurrungi Big, the laws of the land, our customary laws, but we also accept the different ways of the European. This is the same way we share respect to each other's diversities, cultures, and religious beliefs today. And we are here to celebrate this event. It's very important for all of us to be a part of this amazing journey that you will be going on. We call that Chanabi. We must remember the celebration of life, the arrival of new children, the coming of our seasons, the visiting of the clans was an important part of our traditional life. And today we support the celebration of our modern Indigenous arts and culture. This has been our ancestors' legacies. Respecting Pabanata, or paying respect to sacred ground. We should all acknowledge the sacred ground on which we stand. And today we are a host to many people from many different nations and countries. And we still call upon them to continue to respect the sacredness of our country, our lands, and the history and the heritage of country. The struggles to preserve our culture and traditions began with our ancestors in 1830s. And then one of the most important lessons we should take from that struggle was the way they forged an alliance that led to many of our achievements that sometimes we take for granted today. While we may have descended from different clans and language groups, our grandparents, our great-grandparents worked together to achieve the outcomes we can all celebrate today. And they're one of the most important things we can learn from that lesson of the past. And today it's my hope that we can all take pride in our shared history and celebrate the strength of our great nation. And according to our traditions, our lands will always be protected by our Creator, Bunjil, who travels as an eagle, and by Wan, who protects our waterways, travels as a crow. Bunjil taught us to always welcome guests, but he required us to ask all guests to make a number of commitments. One, not to harm our big bigs, our lands, not to harm our waterways, our warani, and not to harm Bunjil's children, our bubups. And this commitment is made through an exchange of a small bow dipped in the water of the land. So once again, Wamanjika, Marin Big Big, Bunurong, Nermderp, Barupton, Arta Willem. Come with a purpose to our beautiful home. Wamanjika means come, ask to come, and what is your purpose for coming? So that's something, it's more than not a welcome, it's a directive. We always think it's got to be a welcome, but it's real, in our words, in our language, it means come with a purpose. And we all come with a purpose because we're here to celebrate Stella Day Out, which I'm loving. It's a challenge, isn't it? But our diverse community groups, our non-binary groups, and our, what do you call it, mainstream groups, I don't know, they all got different and they should be celebrated, that we can all come together as a unit, a strong supporting unit to each other's diversity. So Nungunjin, you are in my presence and I am in yours. Have a great day. Have a great Stella day out. They've got to begin, hey? It all began somewhere. Yeah. Different ways. We didn't have writing those days. We just listened. It was a deep listening. I think it is about coming back to how we listen to each other. And somebody asked me what it was like. Said, what do you think? And I said, it's about communication, how effective we can become as communicators. Do we meet the needs of that diversity, always coding ourselves and being respectful for our diversities and our communities? So communication is a specific art, and valuing that diversity, the art of communicating.
Well, I'm just going to firstly thank Auntie Carolyn, not just for the welcome to country, but for that beautiful narrative about care and respect and love. And I think that's something that we all very much value, and particularly today when we've got so much care and love and respect with our beautiful Stella Prize-winning authors. Hello and welcome to the inaugural Stella Day Out. My name is Fiona Sweet and I'm the Executive Director and CEO of Stella. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, who are the Wurundjeri and the Kulin Nation, and their elders past and present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. Bit of housekeeping before we start. There are tote bags on your seats. They do look a little bit like those 1950s little, what are they called? Tiramacasses or? Antimacassars. It's always in the crossword puzzle, isn't it? Antimacassars. So those bags are for you to take, and should you choose to step outside and buy a book from the reading stall, you can put those books in that lovely Stella bag, and there's a little program in there which outlines the day that we've had today. You all, I think, are quite aware that there's free coffee, tea, spiral, coconut water and treats out there. So please, after the session, feel free to chat with your friends about the session. The authors will probably be doing some book signings, and I just want to thank our sponsors, Creative Victoria, for this beautiful building that they've given us to use today, Mecca Empower Bonsoi for their generosity. There's also a little scan that you can scan outside in that cafe bar area if you'd like to give us some feedback, which we'd be very grateful for, because of course it is our first Stella Day Out. So on to the most important thing. Today we're here to talk about poetry with Lucy Van and Thuy On, and they'll be in conversation with Nadia Niaz and discussing today the landscape of poetry in Australia. There'll be a bit of time towards the end of the session to ask questions. Please make them feel very, very welcome.
Thanks, everyone, and welcome. I will introduce our panelists. I should tell you who I am. I'm Nadia. Hi. And I'm the author of The Gen Hunters, which came out just very recently, and I founded the Australian Multilingual Writing Project, which is a terrible title, I'm so sorry, but it is what it does it sort of does what it says on the box. We publish multilingual writing, and I teach creative writing at the University of Melbourne. My guests today are Thuy On, who is an arts journalist, critic, editor, and poet. Sorry, I have to read this from the thing. She's the reviews editor for the online publication Arts Hub. She has 2 poetry collections published by University of Western Australia Publishing, Turbulence and Decadence, which was nominated for the Stella this year. And with her, we have Lucy Van, who is the poet speaking on the Figures EP produced by Leila Sakini, which is and the writer of The Open, which was longlisted for the Stella Prize, shortlisted for the Mary Gilmore Award, and highly commended by the Anne Elder Award. Her poems and essays have appeared in places including Best of Australian Poems, Debris, Cordite Poetry Review, Australian Poetry Journal, Rabbit, Axon, Meanjin, Australian Book Review, Liminal Review of Books, History of Photography, Journal of Australian Studies, and Southerly. She's been a writer in residence at Overland and a Melbourne Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne, where she also teaches poetry. So welcome. So I had the pleasure of reading their collections and getting to sort of really do a deep dive into them. So I have a lot of very, very nerdy questions. However, I think the question I'd like to start with is, what do you love most about your book at the moment? And maybe also if there's a poem that started it all or that you are particularly fond of, could you share that with us? Thuy, would you like to start?
Sure. So can everyone hear me? I'm not sure if this mic is on. I wrote Decadence because I wanted a book that I couldn't see outside the poetry landscape. So I think it's true that sometimes you write for yourself more than you write for a particular audience. I wrote it for myself. I wanted a poetry book that was playful and fun, because I think a lot of people have this idea that contemporary poetry is very heavy-going and overtly political and just kind of oppressive and heavy and dark. And I just wanted to write a poem that was fun and funny and also poked a satirical sort of swipe at the books industry that I know so well. I've been a books critic for 25 years, so the first third of Decadence is about language and about the books industry. I had a lot of fun writing this book, which was a little bit tonally a lot different from my previous book, Turbulence. So I guess they're almost complementary in a way. As for a poem that started it all, okay, when people think of the word decadence in contemporary parlance, it kind of means moral and cultural decline, which I thought was super depressing. I just wanted to revamp that word and say, well, decadence also means sort of wallowing in pleasure and enjoyment. And why can't we have that? Why does it have to be morally and culturally sort of just bad? And I'm going to read a poem called Decadence, which is what this book is named after. And it's quite hard because a lot of my poems are for the page. So for me to read it, you kind of miss a lot of the nuance, because I play around with syntax and line breaks and silences between words, and you can't sort of understand what I'm talking about until you actually read the page. But for this poem, I just want you to close your eyes as I read it, because you have to look in your visual eye and kind of see what I'm talking about when it comes to punctuation. Okay, so I'm going to read out Decadence. It's a very short poem. So, Decadence. Lying on our side in concavity, spoon nesting the warmth of skin, your breath on my shoulder, an idle arm draped like loose ribbon. 2 commas, an extra long pause. After so much exertion, there's respite. We've just bracketed, encircled one another. I don't want an ellipsis fade to black, but an arrest in time, or backward space to the first line in our story. And that was Decadence. Thanks, Nadia. Lucy, what about you?
Is this, that's working, right? Yeah.
I think
you can have
that.
it's two sort of confessions, like much, like really sort of pragmatic issues. I was actually writing, and I'm still writing it, a different book called The Beginning of the Poem, which is not a poetry book, it's about poetry, and it actually, that's sort of, to use your expression, it does what it says on the box, looking at a kind of a way of understanding what the beginning of the poem signifies. And it's probably a little bit too hard for me, you know, to be honest. But it's a study of, I guess, issues of language and what it means to write in a colonial language. Anyway, that's been around for ages, and for some reason, the time when I should have been finishing that book, I wrote this book, and it felt like the proposition of poetry afforded something, like it enabled me to say what I wanted to say in the book that I couldn't write. And I think it sounds kind of high-minded, but it's actually the pragmatic answer. So a lot of the issues about language, about, to use that cliche, but who speaks, could be said more effectively within poetry than about poetry. And a lot of the issues around land as well that I was kind of dealing with in that other book, I could kind of more effectively navigate here. But the other like pragmatic answer is I was like asked if I would like to write a book with Bella Lee, who's just this legendary Australian poet in her own right, but also probably like the best editor that could possibly exist. And so it was also just like a sort of just, there wasn't anything to say, like to stop me from wanting to do that. So I kind of wrote it with Bella. And a lot of the things that are good about this book are actually from her, I think. So that's my answer to the question. Yeah.
And would you like to read?
Sure. Okay. This was just where it opened. This is called Bush Poem. It's actually one of the few poems that is enjambed. Most of the poems are in prose paragraphs, but this one isn't. So I guess it's more of a lyric. Every land is a way of speaking. Every way of speaking is a land. Even in this oppression, I, a stake in some mad fence, impound this land. No. I thought, create nothing, defeat the purpose, leave the trees there, leave the leaves there, leave, don't recall any names. Turn around or turn loose where I or you or some third person, some terrible smart cunt goes into the countryside, even though walking is clearing. I, a mast, stupidly seafaring, all I in the mountains, oceans, all door in the commons, open doors are commas, slammed doors are exclamation marks, broken off the frame a slash, a sliding door, one kind of dash. Asterisk, a little chip on my shoulder. Footnotes, the witty shoes I tripped in all the way to meet you. I thought I could be a house that I never leave or fix, that I could annex. I am very much over introducing things and, of course, very pleased to meet you in this extended preface. You have a beautiful face, especially behind this door where I stand in infinite regress with the doorkeeper. I bloody love a good door. Where did you get it? How does it sound when it opens and shuts? Left open, I thought, like a tree, like a nation of trees. I don't know its name. I come here again before I leave you my address, in water and dissolution, in the shadow of a bulldozer or a man from the country, in his property by logical procedure. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I have to say it's wonderful to actually hear poets reading their work out loud as well, especially when you've read it. I'm like, oh, that's, yeah, you was there. I was. It's yeah, it's really interesting to hear what the voice does or imbues poetry with. And you touched on a bunch of things that I like. My mind is running off into 20 different directions about questions that I want to ask you, but I think I will focus on one at a time and try. Now, both of you have sort of, well, you write academically about poetry, Lucy, and Thuy, you have a career as a critic. How does your relationship with that kind of critical analysis of language, do you think? Like, do you think it has anything to do with your poetry? Does it affect your poetry? And does your poetry affect it?
I think my experience as an arts critic and my experience as a poet are both sides of the same coin. I think to be a good poet and to be a good critic, you have to have passion and you have to have rigor. And they sort of play off one another. I always think, I mean, as a poet, and Lucy knows this, we don't have an abundance of words to play with. We have to be very specific with what words we end up using. We're not a prose poet. I mean, I don't really write, well, you are, but I'm not a novelist, you know, I will never be a novelist because they have, I guess, the indulgence of writing tens of thousands of words. Whereas a poet, you have to be super concise. And to same with a critic, you have to get to the essence of the matter. You don't have tens of thousands of words to review a play or a book. And it's the same with poetry. I always think of my poetry in particular as a bonsai, you know. So when I'm editing, I go back and delete. I don't add things, I actually delete. So when you actually think of a bonsai plant, you're trying to structure it so it can actually look winsome and pretty. You're not adding more leaves on there. So I'm always reducing to the essential, to the essence. And with my, I guess, my writing criticism, which I've done for so long, I'm trying to understand what the point of it is. What is the point of this novel? What is the point of this theatre production? Does it work? Why doesn't it work? And everything that sort of, you know, helps or detracts from the workmanship of the book or the theatre production. So I'm actually lucky. I really think that, and I think for me it works really well because passion comes from my poetry, which everything I write is undergirded by passion. And rationality comes from my criticism. So I have to be, and they're both really finely balanced. I have to do basically both. I have to be passionate and rigorous in both art forms. And so they both bounce off one another. And it just feels, I feel like I'm a more sort of well-balanced person for being a critic and a poet. Lucy?
So nice. That sounds amazing. I feel like I'm the exact opposite. Like I'm a very not balanced human being. And actually, I feel like I'm always struggling with all forms of writing that I do. Like, and that there is always like this kind of weird thing that I've done with a structure, even of something really straightforward. For some reason, I won't get to the heart of it. It's like this kind of resistance to doing something in a way that makes sense. And so there's a perversion or something that I think I don't know, like it makes life really difficult, but it also, I think, propels the work in a certain kind of way that is important.
Which means if there's friction in anything, Lucy, you try and work through it.
Yes.
Don't you?
Yeah.
You know, so
yeah, every time it's like, oh, I've made it incredibly difficult. And then I suppose it's because, and structure really is important. Structure is such a kind of, I don't know, underrated aspect of thought. And so even with something that seems like a straightforward, like description of a piece of, another piece of work, how you tell that story, as you say, like how you explain what the essence of it is, depends on structure too, not just the content of, so it's kind of, there is the precision, but there is also the kind of like the sense that you never are really on top of like what you're trying to do. And
and
like
also,
that's for me.
and you forget to, and there's many parts of the poem, even my poem, which are really short and mostly a page, because you're thinking of the words, you're thinking of the structure, you're thinking of the lines, the line formation, you're thinking of the silences in between. And the same with the review. When I'm writing book review or theatre review, I'm thinking about the characters. If I'm talking about a book, I'm thinking of the language, I'm thinking of the narrative. So there's so many parts of it that as a general reader, you don't really think about it. But when you actually do it yourself, you think, oh my gosh, there's so many aspects of writing a poem, there's so many aspects of writing a review that people just take for granted that just exist. But there's behind the scenes, you know, there's a lot, there's, you know, that whole duck swimming and you don't get to see his little legs underneath the water paddling away furiously. I think that's like writing a review and that's like writing a poem. You don't see the work, but there's a lot of work that gets into it.
Yeah, it's funny because I was talking to a student of mine about that and about how when you read a book, you don't actually know which sentence took the longest to write. There are some sentences that you read that seem effortless, that probably took like years to get right, and there are some that just float out without a second thought, and you don't know the difference as a reader, but as a writer,
it's harder than it thinks, harder than it looks.
Yeah, it really is, isn't it? But at the same time, like when you, again, like as usual, I want to ask two different questions at the same time. One of them is about the actual physical structure of your books. Like you both of you have your books sort of contain sections, and you've sort of ordered your poems in a particular way. And I'm curious about whether that was a product of writing. Did that happen organically, or did you start with the structure?
It started for me with a structure. As I said, nothing is done accidentally for me. I'm quite organised a person. So when I started Decadence, I knew it was going to be categorised in 3 sections. And I knew already which sections there would be. So if you pick up Decadence, it's divided into 3 metaphysical spaces. They're the 3 sections, and already I'm playing with words. And the first section is, as I say, meta, and it's all very self-reflexive and playful, and it's a riff on language and publishing and books, which I know a lot about. So it's a lot of fun, the first third. The second is physical and sort of about my short-lived relationship affair with a man, and I basically track the trajectory from beginning to end. So it's called physical for obvious reasons. And the last section, spaces, is a little bit more metaphorical, and the spaces in between people, in between words, in between one another, and it's a little bit more, I guess, not as literal. And also, I also knew when I wrote this book that it was going to get progressively, I suppose, a bit more, not darker, but more serious. So I knew I was going to try and get the people in, reel them in with something light and fluffy. And you think, oh my gosh, the whole book is going to be light and fluffy. But no, that's only just to get you in. And then it just gets a little bit more serious as the pages turn. And I did that deliberately because I'm one of those people that don't like one-tone books. Okay, and I knew, and it's the same with my first book, Turbulence. I wanted something that was affecting all your senses. So you read the book, you can laugh and you can snigger and you can feel sad and you can feel happy. I wanted a book that did all of the above. So that's why I deliberately structured in 3 sections. You feel different emotions as you read it, not just like anger or sadness or depression, whatever. So very, very deliberate. Lucy, what about you?
I had an idea of the structure when I started. That was probably the only thing. I had poems, like a couple of poems that I'd written previously. But the main thing was this idea of, this is, the book is called The Open, which is not, it sounds like I'm talking about Heidegger or something, but I'm talking about like the tennis tournament, The Open. Like it was always something that I was fascinated by, and I sort of grew up like playing tennis. My mum was a great tennis player, great club tennis player. And there are lots of issues in tennis that seem to be able to somehow like designate like the ideas in the book. And so it was kind of like I wanted 2 sections, sort of thinking about like 2 sides of the court. And then I sent the manuscript to Bella Lee, and it came back in 4 sections, and I was like, oh, okay. And it actually made much more sense. But I think like there still is a little bit of an imprint of that sort of binary. I love binary form actually, like, and I like this in music and in other sorts of, I guess, expressions. Like I like this idea, yeah, like you can have two different tones running alongside, and actually that there isn't like a third part in this book, at least, that resolves. Like it's just these two halves that don't give you the solution or something. And it probably doesn't come through now, but I had originally conceived of it as the way that a tennis match is an interesting kind of conversation, you know, and you never know what's going to happen, like with that return. I think that was, maybe that's like one of the operative words actually, was like what happens with the return. Like, so that is the sort of the structure of the book. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. On that as well, there's a great sense of play in both of your books, and this is something that we sort of touched on right at the beginning, about how poetry does not need to be stodgy and dark and dreary and droopy and all of those things, and there is this element of lightness, sort of play, in both your works, and I wondered, like, again, like what is your relationship with language, or with playing with language? I mean, I've never opened a book of poetry and cackled when I read when I've read the table of contents. So
I'm so glad to hear that, Nadia.
yeah, no, I laughed out loud.
I'm so glad that even the table of contents made you laugh. That's wonderful. I think I just deliberately wanted, as I said, I wanted a book that was fun and funny and fun to write. Because I was also, when I was sort of putting this together, I was putting myself in the reader's point of view, and I thought, all right, I want to do something different. You know, maybe because a lot of the poetry books I was reading at the time was just so dark and oppressive, and I just thought, I want something different. I want someone to read it and kind of smirk. And I'm glad that at least you sort of felt that way. Can I just quickly read a poem out? I just want to, people are thinking, what is she talking about? All right, people keep asking me, because I write all different things, but why poetry, Thuy? Why do you write poetry? I mean, I guess the subtext is, why don't you write one of those rural noir detective fiction that, you know, sells $1 million worth of, why write something as obscure and niche as poetry? So I got so fed up, I wrote a poem called Why Poetry. So I just want to read that out so you get a flavour of why I do this. Okay, so why poetry? 1, because you saw we pushing through the cracks and decide you need to create a whole iambic pentameter scaffold around this precious green metaphor of hope. 2, because psychologists are too expensive for bile and blood regurgitation. 3, because you met someone who needs to be immortalized before age dulls their eyes and cools your heat. 4, because you fancy yourself an eco-warrior as the world burns and drowns. 5, because society's done you wrong. So instead of a thesis only your supervisor will read, you shrink wrap your consternation into a sanquain that only 2 more people will read. 6, because you're into single-page instant gratification. 7, because they don't allow line breaks and stanzas in letters to the editor. 8, because loneliness and sexual frustration need an outlet. 9, because you're lazy and don't want to story plot with 3 unreliable narrators and a past and present timeline that spans half a century. 10, because you want to make sure the pedants count out all the haiku syllables. And that's why I write poetry. How do you do it, Lucy? Why do you do this?
I don't know. I think I am like a very simple person in a way. Like I always actually wanted to be a critic, and I wanted to be, I wanted to write. I was like, I want to be the person who is who will write poetry reviews and things like that and isn't a poet, because there is a kind of like problem, if I can say it that way, where often people who are reviewing poetry, like not exclusively, but they're poets themselves, and not everyone who reviews a film is also a filmmaker, or you know what I mean? Like there's kind of like this. There is an odd kind of like, I don't know, like cannibalized like format to this. I was like, I want to be that person, and then for some reason, I think I was misunderstood as a person who wrote poetry, and I was like, okay. And then I wrote, would you like to read at this thing? I was like, oh, all right, I'll write a poem, and then it started that kind of way. So I felt like I was just like there are aspects of me that are actually quite obedient, and so because I was asked, I was like, okay, I will, and it just sort of like has kept on happening. So that's the.
Once
I
you
think
get the
that's
poetry bug, it's very hard to lose it.
It is also, I think, like if you end up reading poetry for a long time, it fundamentally changes the way that you are, I think, like not just the way that you write. And so there are things that it does that nothing else can do. And also there are, like, if you love reading poetry, you sort of end up, sort of like responding to it with your own poetry. And it's not that individualistic. It's actually incredibly communal. Yeah, it is strongly dialogic, if I can use that word, kind of form. So I think that's what's going on. I think that's why I write it. I mean, I don't know. Like, it's a terrible.
Yeah.
it's a terrible way to sort of like live in a like practical sense, but it actually also affords like pleasures and insights that nothing else can.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that, because it is like poetry allows you a kind of insight into experience or life or whatever it is that you're looking at. That, I mean, again, other art forms will offer insight in other ways. Poetry is a very precise kind of almost a microscope on experience, maybe, and it sort of holds the moment.
It is
for a bit longer.
It is like, it's not only, it is an event, this is an event that we're at, but poetry is the event of language, in this extreme sort of sense. And I think that once that event is sort of happening, like you get really hooked on it.
Yeah.
It's distillation. Poetry to me is distillation. When you think of something and then you distill it, the essence of it becomes so much stronger. Okay, so you just all these words, and sometimes you just kind of. I know as a prose reader, sometimes I just skip every second word because I don't need to know everything. But you can't do that with poetry. There's only a very finite number of words, so you have to read each one, and they talk to one another, and they're there for a reason. So I think poetry is incredibly powerful if you are open to it. And people ask me, how do I read poetry? I don't know how to do it. My suggestion is like, pick a book of a collection of poems. It could be by the same author, it could be different authors. Read one poem a night. Do that. Do it before you go to sleep and think of it. Muse on it, dream of it. That's all you have to do. If you can do like one poem a night, that's pretty good. So you don't have to feel like it's some sort of a race. You have to read the entire book in like a day or something. Just read one poem and reflect on it. I would do that if you're just kind of scared of how to actually begin to read poem, because not many people read poetry in this country. There's books published all the time, but not enough readers.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, again, that because poetry holds the moment, it is appropriate really to read it poem by poem, to read books slowly. It bears that. It bears sort of slow reading.
A lot of my poems too, Nadia, are like, I write immediately after the event. So like, how people write diaries, dear diary, today this happened. To me, I do that, but in poetry. Okay, so something happened and it feels so strong and I need to get it out somehow, but I'm not going to write 1,000 words in it. I'm going to write 40 words and that's it. And I look back at all the poems I wrote, particularly in Turbulence, which was written 3 years ago, and that pinpoints the moment that happened. I remember everything about that moment because I wrote it down. So it's like a treasure chest, really, of memories.
Yeah, it really is. And Lucy, I love what you said about poetry as the event of language. Because it's also what you said about poetry exists in conversation, because you're right. Like we do. I mean, I find that I write most when I read poetry. When I'm actually reading poetry, I end up writing a lot more of it. And so I'm curious about what perhaps specifically for these books, but also in general, like what poems or poetry or art were you in conversation with, do you feel, when you were writing The Open?
Oh my God. Do you know, I'd never thought about that until like this exact moment. I had read, this is just what pops into my head, I'd read this book, Ban en banlieue by Banu Kapil, like maybe a couple of years before, and it had such a huge effect on me, and I probably, now that I'm reflecting, I've probably just appropriated like so many of her like I don't know, like tonal aspects. I think that I don't know if people know this poet, like British poet of Indian background who was teaching at that hippie university, Naropa in Colorado. And it seemed so unbothered by, like, it was in violation, this book is in violation of all norms of poetry. So actually there is this sort of like, it is precise, but it also seems to proceed out of precision, like against precision. Like there are paragraphs that go on too long and sort of happy to repeat itself. And there isn't what you would call the lyric on the page. Like it's nothing about it seems to like fit in to like what you would think of with a
But
poem.
that's playful as well.
Yeah.
You know, you kind
Absolutely,
of like deconstruct your idea of what a poem is, which is also fun. So.
Yeah, I think I was thinking, I think that it had a huge effect on me, and I still think about that book a lot. And it's, I don't know, there are a few different poets. Anne Carson, which is a totally different kind of poet, but I think in terms of like the extremity of the event, like that is in her poetry and, you know, in her translations, especially translations of Sappho, that also, it's like, I feel like I think about her translation of Sappho, if not Winter, daily, you know, like it's so, there is also something about that book too. Those are two off the top of my head. Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thuy, what about you? Were there any poets or pieces of art or anything else that you felt that you were, in conversation with, channeling, thinking about, or influenced by?
I don't know if I was directly influenced by it, but I know that a poet that I really admire is Maxine Benedict Clark. I really like her because she's direct and she's passionate.
Yes.
And she writes about, you know, global and international politics, but she also writes about the personal experience, and she manages to do that without being absolutely pretentious about it. My absolute bugbear is like poetry that you have no idea what it's about, it's impenetrable. I like poetry that is kind of simple, it's multi-layered, but it's simple. You know what the poet's trying to say. You know, I can't stand it when, and I'm educated, you know, I have degrees and all this stuff, and I've read poems that have won competitions, and I have absolutely no idea what he's talking about. And that does a major disservice to poetry, because it's like, if I don't understand it and I'm educated, what's the average person out there? What do they think? They just think, you know, poetry is all wanky now because they have no idea what this poetry is about.
Yeah.
So my ideal poetry is something that is passionate and powerful and direct and speaks to me. I don't really want to sit there with a dictionary and trying to figure out what that Latin phrase means, because a lot of poets kind of like to sort of like show their intelligence that way, and I just find it absolutely unnecessary and counterproductive.
Yeah.
So I guess that's one poet that I'm not sure she directly influenced me, but I knew that I wanted that directness and that passion in my own poetry.
Yeah, that makes sense. And just sort of on that as well, like, do you, I mean, you know, we were talking about scenes and poetry scenes and things like that, and how my only real experience is with the Melbourne poetry scene, and as such, a very limited kind of thing, because I came at it as an academic. But what do you find, like, where do you feel you sit within what's happening in Australian poetry today? What do you feel is happening at the moment?
Lucy?
Yeah.
We're obviously in a renaissance of a few different things of Aboriginal writing or First Nations writing. This is happening right now, and it's probably the most important thing to say, actually, what's happening. But that actually also like connects with what's happening in poetry now, and there is a renaissance of poetry in Melbourne specifically, but also more broadly in Australia, and it materializes in lots of different ways, like in sort of, there are like designations that I don't really invest in that much, like page poetry or stage, but you know, like for the sake of this, like it can be like a thriving spoken word scene, which is huge, you know, and should be taken, like should be respected, I suppose, even though I don't really like it that much, if I can say that. But that is that sort of, there is that happening in Melbourne, and then alongside that you have performances that aren't necessarily considered spoken word, but you know, like events where people will read. So something like Sick Leave is a really big, I guess, scene. It's a sort of a one centre of Melbourne poetry, and then obviously like the letters as well, as in like the literary publications, the books. There are so many books of poetry that people are actually like, I feel like people are really reading poetry in a way that they weren't even like 6 years ago, and definitely not as they were 15 years ago. So there is a kind of I don't know, buzz about the form. I'm surprised, because when I was first involved with poetry, you'd go to a thing and it would be kind of just the friends that you asked to come, and you know, maybe not even most of them. Like, and now you sort of will go somewhere, and it seems to be like the place to be that night. It's a huge kind of, and I know that people don't necessarily. People can sort of feel like they don't want to be too invested in a scene, but I think that for all the coterie sort of aspects, or the things where it can seem cliquey or exclusive or whatever, I think that it does serve a good purpose for kind of like actually advancing just the cause of poetry, and people sort of, you know, if someone ends up kind of picking up a book that they wouldn't have otherwise, or if they have that moment, I think it's a good thing. Younger as well, and I'm very confused about why it's I don't know why it's happening, but it's definitely something that's happening.
People seem less afraid of poetry. I would have said maybe 10 years ago, oh yeah, people are terrified of poetry. And I was thinking that just now, and kind of went, actually, I think that that's changed.
Do you know what? I reckon the fact that the Stella Prize was won 2 years in a row by poets, no less, has something to do with it. So yay for, you know, Drop Bear, and yay for the Jaguar.
Yeah,
that's true. That is true.
It just makes people think, oh wow, maybe poetry is actually worth reading after all. So long we've been sidelined and sort of considered not really that important. So maybe slowly people are just, you know, realizing that poetry is actually a pretty cool art form.
Yeah. And that there are so many different types of poetry, because as you were saying, that there are different scenes, and so if one scene isn't for you, you'll find something else.
There's so many different poetry collections out there. You just have to find one that resonates with you.
Yeah.
So you know, there's something out there for everyone. I guarantee you.
Yeah. Yeah. And because again, it's that moment that poetry gives you, and I think that part of the popularity of it probably has to do with things like Instagram and social media and TikTok, and the fact that people post poetry online and read poetry online. And yeah, I mean, you know, a lot of it is, but it's I don't think that necessarily the like analyzing it for quality and all of that is necessarily useful. I think the fact that people are actually engaging with the art form. I mean, 90% of all art forms
sometimes, isn't it? Yeah. You just have to, sometimes you just have to enjoy it and not think too deeply about it and write essays and theses about it. Just enjoy it for what it is.
Yeah. There is very much a sort of a joy in writing poetry that I find that, like, for poetry to be poetry, I mean, again, I'm sort of defining, which is always a terrible idea, but for poetry to be poetry, it has to lift off the page somehow. There's something about the words, something about the language needs to spark. And that happens regardless of topic or theme or how, you know, dark the theme might be. There's just this sort of joyfulness of language that persists in poetry. And again, going back to what you said about, you know, the event of language, there's something that poetry does that other forms don't do.
Yeah. I think of, if I can say,
Yeah, absolutely.
like that. This is such a dorky reference, but W.H. Auden's very famous elegy in memory of W.B. Yeats, has that famous line, or these famous lines: "Poetry makes nothing happen; it is the happening." Like that idea. It survives in the valley where executives, would never tamper. It survives happening a mouth. That's the sort of thing that's often quoted, and so we all walk away going, oh, okay, so cool, poetry makes nothing happen, okay. But actually the most, to me, critical part of that poem is at the end, if I can remember it, in the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. That is what poetry does. It teaches people, in a way, how to think about their lives, how to talk about their lives in a way that directs them to maybe think about how to do something differently in the future or more effectively or something, and I don't know, it's another one that I think about a lot. It doesn't really make you, I don't know, go join XR or something like it. That's not the way that it works, I think. But it might kind of, in the prison of your days, teach the free man how to praising, to sort of use it in some way to think about the way that you live. Yeah.
Sometimes you can write poetry and it will subtly change someone's opinion. It might not be deliberately overtly political, but I don't really write overtly political poetry, but I have written poetry that, to me, is trying to change someone's opinion or shift something, which is sort of hard to explain. Can I read something out and I'll explain what I mean? I wrote this poem because I was utterly fed up of the trope of the feminist, of the female muse, and the one. She's lying back naked, just bored, while the male artist is there with his paintbrush. And you see it all the time, millennia of artwork. And I thought, oh God, I'm so sick of this. I want to write a poem that actually turns the tables and says, well, hey, female artists, we can do it too. So I wrote this distinctly feminist poem. I just want to quickly read it out. Sometimes I just think talking about poetry is really hard. You have to read it and then you can, get what I'm trying to talk about. So this is called Found Object. I want someone I can turn into art. Splice him into shapes, assemble him again, slightly askew. I want to impasto his body into thick strokes, lather on the touch, textured wetly. I want to rinse out his eyes, replace with cyan drips from a sharp nib, pinpointed deep. I want to baroque him in gold leaf, all fired shimmery, theatre in repose, gilded in heat. I want Pollock impulses tenderized by water lilies, a soul on virgin canvas, stretch, taut. I want someone I can turn into art, stenciled with precision, and my name is smeary triumph on the bottom right corner. So that's that sting, because I'm the damn artist in this one. This is the female gaze for a change. I'm sick of looking at all these female nudes. Turn the tables.
Yes.
Female artists, we can do the same thing,
Absolutely. Lucy, would you like to read something from
Okay.
the collection?
There is something in here that is also the female gaze, now that I think about it. All right, this is from the third section. It's called Australian Open 1, and it's one of the sections that's very into the actual tennis tournament as it's unfolding in Melbourne. In the second men's semi-finals, there are two beautiful males, les beaux boys, warming up the court. After several minutes watching the player profiles, my mother says gravely, "They're both very good looking." We were determined to know these beings.
This is a totally female principle of gratification, knowing beings. This was our daily work, this agricultural labour, curious all summer to make this surface produce this pulse. Thoreau said he was determined to know beans. Beans, the bean field being a pun for the being field, this pun alluding to a relation to land set out by the Georgic, being guaranteed by turning land to profit. Though he says I was much slower and much more intimate with my beans than usual. Here is the responsible non-dreamer working only for tropes and commentary in the only open and cultivated field. As I have little experience with this sort of work, there is not yet any commentary. That's all.
Thank you. I have to say, it's just really lovely to hear you. It's like when you run into an old friend after a while. It's like I know this, but this is different. Yeah, it's lovely. Thank you. We've got 10 minutes for questions, so if anyone would like to ask our panelists a question. Oh, sure. Are we doing mics or?
We're still not completely recorded. Can I take that mic and then give it back to you?
Okay. Thank you so much for your time today. And my question is about editing. Lucy, you made references to Bellamy through the session today, and I know your works, both of you also. One self edits, and Nadia, you are an editor amongst many things. I just wanted to understand in your work what role an editor plays, I suppose, in terms of boundary. And how much would a poet allow for the work to get changed by an editor? Or is there like I suppose, a boundary within your own self that you would not allow for an editor to cross? I suppose the role in connection with boundary, if that makes sense.
Would you like to go?
My publisher was very hands-off with my poetry. We just read through and made sure there was no typos, but they, I guess, trusted me. And also because they knew I was a critic, and I was the world's worst editor because I can edit my own work and I'll be severely harsh about it. So they really didn't do much in terms of structure or line editing, probably because they published my previous one. It's the same publisher, so they knew that I knew what I was doing. So they weren't like, okay, you have to change this. And also poetry is so delicate and so personal, isn't it? You change one word, then you have to change the whole poem sometimes. So if publishers and editors know that, they can't just go in there and say, hey, that word there, can you move it? And you'd be like, yes, but I can move it, but then I have to change the whole poem, and then it makes sense, and then I have to change the tone. And you move one line, and of course it affects the entire poem. You can do that easily, I guess, with prose, because you can cut sways, hundreds of words out, and you wouldn't even know the difference. But you cut one word from a small poem, and it makes all the difference. Do you agree? Do you agree, Lucy?
No.
Okay, fine. My experience then.
I'm like heretical in this sense. I think that you can translate poetry. I think you can reformat. I think obviously it's completely different, but I also think that it will still be the same. That's like this weird position that I have. But I'm thinking about Ouyang Yu, who I spoke to once in a conversation a bit like this, and I love people that are like hardline, no. Not only should you not have an editor, but you should not edit your own work either. Just get it done, write your poem, and I respect that in a lot of ways. I think there are just different people are different, and so different ways. I think like Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot is such a great example of like making a work collaboratively, because The Wasteland is whatever you think about The Wasteland, but that is a work of two people in dialogue about what should happen, and the interventions by Pound were pretty like severe by anyone's measure, and I think that the issue of intention, if it can be sort of somehow like whatever was intended can somehow be felt in the final product. I suppose it doesn't to me matter. But at the same time, I was like outraged when when changes were suggested, and I had to sort of walk away and then see that it was a better book for those changes.
Quickly. So Decadence was barely touched from my original manuscript, but my first book, Turbulence, was edited by the late Geordie Elveston. She taught me to be a better poet. I was so scared of her because she's won millions of awards and she's been in the industry for a long, long time. But she took the manuscript of Turbulence and she pruned it and she moved things around. I accepted about, I guess, 70% of the edits and the rest I kept because I thought, no, you changed this too much, even for me. So the first book, I thought I needed some sort of editorial guidance from an actual poet. But then by the second book, I thought, no, I think I know what I'm doing. I don't need anyone to look over my shoulder. So I think that was me being a bit more confident second time round. Well, the first time I was super scared and I just thought, had imposter syndrome. So I'm not a poet. I know what I'm doing. So I needed a guiding hand. Decadence came fully formed, very little editorial changes.
Can I say one tiny thing? Sorry. I think sometimes an editor can ask a question that changes your whole life. And so there was just one little mark on a poem, which was, why are you enjambing? And it was like, it was like, yes, that is the question. The question of prose poetry is not, why is this in prose? It's why is it lineated? Like, why break the line? And it was, a really powerful question. That was all I wanted to, I think sometimes, even if the editor doesn't change what's on the page, that question can change you. It's a valuable relationship.
Okay, I'm a teacher and I'm here with some of my students. So I'm just keen to the kind of idea of introducing poetry to kids at school, of school age. Are we, as teachers and as a community, trying to create poetry readers, people to love buying the poetry and reading it? And we are also creating young poets. Would you like to reflect, each of you, on the poems and the authors, the poets that affected you at school? Do you think poetry can be taught? Is it something you have to find yourself? How can a teacher motivate you towards the goal?
As I think I said before, Maxine Benedict Clark, she has a recent poetry collection out, probably more towards primary school kids, but The Sound of the Thing, 100 poems for kids. I wish I had that book when I was growing up, because that would have propelled me towards poetry at a younger age. I think as you get older, maybe in secondary school, you get force-fed Shakespeare. And he's a poet primarily, remember that. People forget he's actually a poet.
Yeah.
People think he's just this dude that wrote a lot of plays, but I think as teachers, if you can somehow, if you're still being taught Shakespeare and kids kind of just roll their eyes a lot, but whatever it is that you are taught in school, sometimes you have to find the poetry in it and teach poetry even through prose. Does that make sense? And teach, if the kids are being taught Shakespeare, maybe isolate a paragraph and just go through it through a poetic lens instead of a narrative. What's happening with Macbeth, blah, 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 then he does this. But if you can read, it's like a poet. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow he has some of the most beautiful poems that people just kind of skip over. I guess I'm a little bit out of touch with what they teach at schools, and it's hard for us to, I guess for me and Lucy, to elaborate because every school is different. Some schools have sort of very old-fashioned texts, other schools have a lot more contemporary texts. I don't actually know what the poetry curriculum is in secondary schools, because I know it varies from school to school and even from state to state. So, obviously I would say, yay, more poetry in schools, but it so depends, I guess, on the poet and what's age appropriate. What do you think, Lucy? I mean,
I think you can definitely teach poetry well. I think that I had great teachers in high school that, you know, really changed me. And I think don't underestimate the capacity of children. Like, they actually respond to poetry incredibly well, maybe even like more strongly than other forms. Like, not that I understood, because I don't think you can, but speaking of Eliot, I remember reading Proofrock in whatever, you know, it was one of the set texts. And it was just, I knew that something was going on. That was sufficient as an experience, that just to read it and to hear it read. I think that expectation that we understand is probably the problem, like, and that you have to come away and, you know, pass an exam with like this account of like some guy, like this modernist, or I think that is a real problem. I think if it could just be incorporated in just generally the way that we, I don't know, like learn about, as you said, about other things,
and
it
also
could
I
be
just
great.
thought about something. Rally your school to try and get Australian poets to visit.
Yes.
It makes a huge difference if students actually hear and listen to actual poets like me and Lucy talk about our craft and read some of the poems, because otherwise they think poetry is basically Shakespeare or whatever it is that you're teaching them, some war poet who lived 100 years ago. Because that's, you know, and that's it. They don't have any sort of inclination of what a modern poet, a contemporary Australian poet, reads like or looks like or anything. So there's this weird sort of separation. And they're sort of reading text that was written 100,000 years ago, whatever. That feels like 100,000 years ago when we're 16. And they don't know what a modern poet is like, because we never crossed paths, you know. So maybe rally the school to try and get a visiting poet. And I think that might change a couple of minds and what poetry can be like.
I think that something like the Stella Prize and then this event is really helpful in that way, because, as you said, like, it sort of brings poetry to the general consciousness as well, and it's not some sort of stultified little thing that you have in like siloed away, and you can only look at legitimately great poets, and you can only read the greats. There's modern poetry happening, and the fact that I think that tapping into the joy of poetry again, and the fun of it, because I learned poetry from my grandmother in a completely different language. And she eventually realized that I wasn't going to really be any good at Persian. So she allowed English in. And there were some poets who were deemed like good enough. But it was all about play and all about figuring out what the words mean, and playing with rhyme and rhythm and cadence. And there's so much joy and so much fun to be had with poetry. And I think it's really sad that we don't teach it, because, again, we're afraid of it. We're afraid of teaching the wrong thing. But I don't think we need to be, because any way into poetry, I think, is a good thing. So, do we have time for one more question?
One person, a very quick question. We've already got the next thing started. Just one more short question.
Hi. My question is around, do you have a formula for your writing process? And if so, what is that?
A formula? No. The short answer is no. I write my poems at the end of days, in between other things I'm doing. I've written poems on napkins, on bits of scraps of paper I found at the bottom of my bag, in airports, you know, at 3 o'clock in the morning when I can't sleep. There is no structure with me, and I guess that's when poetry comes to me. I guess it just comes when it does, and I try and lasso it and pin it down when I can, and then when I have time, I will look back, and usually it's like for me it's like a scrap. It's like a word or a phrase, and I think, oh, that's good, I'm going to have to use it somewhere, so I just write it down, and then maybe in a day or half a day, whenever, I'll go back and work it into a poem, but there's no structure, it just happens sort of organically. Lucy, do you have a...
I'm the same in that respect, but I also was just thinking about Auntie Caroline's Welcome to Country, you know, the sort of the full expression of that welcome is what, you know, Wominjeka, what is your purpose? You know, and I think like often it's a
the purpose is kind of, it can be really abstract or it can be kind of material. Like a lot of the time, the one structural thing I have is I have to write this by like the 15th or something because that's the deadline. And that's kind of in a way, or like I have to finish this manuscript or whatever, or I have to read tonight, so I better write a thing. You know, it's sort of. So I think I'm not the only person that's like this. Like, I hate writing. You know, like it's so annoying. Like, you know, and it's such
having written.
no one has any time. Like, how do you, you know? So the structure is actually that it's required and that it has a sort of a purpose that it's going to be for someone else, like in a way for someone to read or hear. So
I think you have to
that's
be
it.
diligent. It doesn't matter when you write. You just have to have this thing in the back of your mind going, right, I need to write somewhere, somehow. But because it's so easy to not do it because everybody procrastinates and has a million other things to do. But you think, because I'm working on my third book now, I'm about 3/4 of the way through, and it's just such a hard slug because I have so many other commitments. But in the back of my mind, I'm also thinking, I have to finish this book. I have to do it. And so I write when I can because I need to do it because I want to finish this third book. It's not going to write itself, unfortunately, so someone has to do it and I have to do it. So yes, there's a sense of like urgency.
Power of deadlines.
Yeah, my own internal deadline.
Well, thank you so much for that. And speaking of the power of deadlines, we've come to the end of our time. But thank you everyone for being here. And thank you so much, Fiona and Claudia and Gabrielle and everyone for inviting us and for having us here.
Thank you.
But yes, we will clear the stage. And
Yes, and Lucy and I will be like hanging around if you need to ask us other questions. So you're hanging around? Yeah, we will be hanging around.